Welcome back, and thanks so much for staying with us. Now, there are fears that students across the globe will find it even more difficult to get to universities in the United States, and this follows the banning of affirmative action admission policies, which allowed for universities to consider a student's race in the admissions process. And global mentorship company Crimson Education says the students will now have to put more emphasis on curating a strong application portfolio that not only highlights academic and extracurricular strengths, but also to tell a story of who they are. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Brad. Just the application itself, and I just want to deal with the expectations, because sometimes, especially when there are all these prospects in this global village, one would take it as a legitimate right to study abroad as opposed to a privilege, which means that it's also highly competitive and you're not entitled to it.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things you do need to think about when you think about the fact that it is a privilege instead of a right is for instance, the cost involved simply in getting across there. But it is extremely competitive with people from all over the world looking to study at some of those top universities abroad in general, not only in the US.
Yeah, and when we talk about affirmative action, these are just one of the policies that they have now scrapped in terms of consideration and what this may mean for prospective students, you know, South African students who want to study abroad. In our definition of how we understand affirmative action, broad-based black economic empowerment and everything, who does it really impact or apply
Realistically,
to?
the Supreme Court decision which outlaws affirmative action in the use of race in college admissions in the States is most likely to affect American-based students. Their idea of building, especially at the elite universities, their idea of building a diverse class has always been kind of at the forefront of the way that they select students. It's not solely based on how good your marks are. And they've outlawed the use of race specifically, which is kind of the way that the top schools like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton have traditionally built their student bodies, looking at the different racial groups that are included and things like that.
But this in itself, in considering a student's race for admission, had been to build a more diverse, student body, as you were saying, and create a, suppose, a broader experience, a more universal experience for students. And if in the absence thereof, I mean, what kind of society are we then raising if people can't interact, mingle, cross-cultural influences, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a consideration that I think was probably overlooked or bypassed when they were making this decision. And part of it, which is a different discussion, is looking at the makeup of the Supreme Court that have kind of overruled this. But realistically, those elite, and it's mainly the private universities that are going to be affected by this, because the public universities do lean more heavily on academics, like in the rest of the world. But those private universities are looking to build more kind of a diversity of thought and experience, much more than anything else, which is much more easily helped by being able to admit people from different groups across the spectrum of sociology and experience.
Yeah, and by affirmative action is obviously we're looking at either Asian students, black students, Indian, etc., or non-white.
Yes.
Okay. But what does this then mean for race relations in the US, especially at academia?
Yes, which are already fraught, as you pointed out. Look, the strange thing about this decision is that the lawsuit that was brought was actually by a group of Asian American students who felt they'd been bypassed in terms of their race, because generally Asian Americans are disproportionately overrepresented in top academic achievement in the States. But it's the kind of backlash that I've seen from my friends in the US and people that I studied with there is that, it's always been kind of a positive thing to be able to build and redress those injustices in the past and disadvantages that have come before. And that might see, as I said, relationships that are already fraught and tough to deal with get worse.
Yeah, so let's bring it back home and look at just South Africans in general who would even be able to afford, let alone be able to go to these Ivy League universities. The second tier, if you will, of universities, are those still applying the race consciousness in terms of the application process?
Generally, all of the properly private elite universities. We saw in the documents filed by Harvard in the lawsuit that around 40% of all universities and 60% of the true kind of liberal elite universities were using race consciously using race as a factor in admitting students into the class. So we will see it be rolled back, but what the decision specifically does not outlaw for these schools is the use of taking into account how race or any other aspect of a student's identity has led them into some kind of adversity in their life experience. So if you can tell that story within your application, which the US application does provide a lot of space for, they are allowed to take that into account.
All right, so if you were saying maybe things like you're asylum seeker because the country that you come from is war-torn, or you are fearing a genocide, this and the other, is that where you're going in terms of students who still can apply to the Ivy Leagues as for consideration?
Not only that, but also literally if by the factor of your race, within the United States, you've experienced some kind of adversity in your life, which obviously we've seen through a number of kind of elements that have happened there that has happened even in the last 20, 30 years. So if you show that, the colleges will be allowed to use that specifically as a factor in determining the success or failure of your application.
All right, and obviously, you just to go back in terms of how you best position yourself and curating that story that will put your application on the top of the pile. What is it that students need to consider if race is not necessarily the box that you need to tick?
The first thing to think about also is that in terms of diversity and students from outside the US, is that race was not necessarily a factor anyway for students coming from outside of the US. What makes you diverse in terms of those universities like the Ivy Leagues or the Ivy Leagues Plus with Stanford and Duke and MIT, what makes you diverse is where you come from. Not necessarily that you are a black South African, but that you are a South African is the way that they seem to have looked at it. The process is mostly non-visible to us. But for building an application, as it's always been, the US universities, especially at the top end, value very strongly and very highly what you do outside of the classroom. So what you put your time into outside of academics and what kind of level you achieve at in those things that you are putting your time into.
Yeah. Putting the time in the application itself, I'm sure it's quite a rigorous and cumbersome exercise that you have to plan ahead of. You yourself having that experience, you mentioned that you had studied abroad, and I'm thinking, so the South African education system can't be that bad. I mean, if it produced a caliber of an expert like yourself, but just assisting students in putting their application together.
Yeah, so obviously our systems here, the IEB, the NSC, our local curricula, are very well respected throughout the world. And putting that application together can be a little bit difficult because it's formed with the idea of an American student applying. So knowing which boxes to tick and what subjects to put down and what extracurricular activities the universities find appealing or attractive, and how to write a personal statement. All of those universities will require you to write one. That can be quite difficult and quite tricky to figure out on your own, as we don't have a ton of resources and experience in South Africa in that area.
So there isn't a template where you can just, upload documents, that kind of thing?
They have a single application portal, which is great. So it's called the Common App. For the US, most universities are on it, most top universities. You fill out your stuff once, and you can send it to multiple universities without having to fill out several different documents. But figuring out what to put in it is where the difficulty that a lot of international students come across is.
All right, and this is where you come in trying to assist at least.
Yes, so trying to assist specifically in the filling out, but also trying to assist in figuring out what you can do to actually make yourself as attractive as possible or as strong as possible a candidate when you're applying to these universities.
Yeah, and do they look at more maybe like STEM subjects, science, technology? Do they look more at innovation or critical skill sets, or can you practically apply for anything?
You can practically apply for anything, and the example I'll use here is most of the Ivy League universities follow a system that's called liberal arts. So in South Africa, most of our universities are pre-professional. You'll go into university studying a professional degree, something that will be related to what you do after you complete your studies. Liberal arts the idea is to give you as much of a breadth of education as possible to teach you how to think, but not necessarily related to what you will do afterwards. So most people, when they apply to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, top universities, Stanford, top universities like that, will not apply with a major. they'll go in open-ended and only select their major maybe in their second year of study.
Okay, just as we let you go, do you have to, is it an advantage if you have a base, for example, in the US, you've got family, or you've got a relative, that is an American citizen?
Realistically, no, it probably isn't an advantage because you're still going to have to reach the level that's required to get into these universities. It's much less kind of points scored than our own universities have, but you are going to have to reach that level either way. It's not going to help you or make you more attractive or less attractive depending on where you come from if your profile is not at the level that it needs to be.
All right. Really, really appreciate it. Brad, thank you for your time. We're speaking to Brad Latila Campbell, Country Manager at Crimson Education, and you can follow them on social media if you are aspiring to study abroad as a young person.